Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you who are here in the room. Also, welcome to those who are online. I'm Sumit Saxena. I'm a researcher at the East West Center. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today. I believe this is the second or third seminar we are having under the East West Center Research Speaker Series. So we are excited about that. So let me introduce Dr. Krupa Rajingam. As a social geographer, heritage management consultant, and conservation architect, she has over 2 decades of field-based experience in diverse aspects of heritage making, management, and development in India, UK, and the US. She advocates for a more informed approach to conservation practice and pedagogy alongside a more grounded and balanced theorization. As an interdisciplinary researcher, her work bridges conservation, anthropology, geography to examine how conservation actors and conservation landscapes are intertwined with issues of social and environmental justice in everyday life, either knowingly or unintentionally, beyond questions of heritage politics. Her doctoral scholarship drew on both her professional experience in ethnography on the famous Hampi World Heritage Site to critique UNESCO World Heritage Management structures on ground as a means to govern people and landscapes. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed international journals, including the Journal of Social Archaeology, Change Over Time, Conservation, and so on, Journal of South Asian Development, so on. So with that, I will turn over the floor to the speaker, but just a bit of housekeeping. I believe you have 45 minutes for your presentation, then we will have question answers for 15 minutes. And those of you who are online can start, I mean, whenever you feel appropriate, pose your questions in the Q&A box of the Zoom interface. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sumi. Before I get started on the lecture, I'd like to first share a few acknowledgements. My presence here, so you don't have to sit through that. First, let's see. All right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Krupa. I'm here in the US as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. And right now I'm here at the University of Hawaii on a 1-week visit, thanks to the Outreach Lecture Fund of the Fulbright program and the Hawaii chapter of the Fulbright Association, represented here by Carlos Juarez and William Chapman. So I thank all my hosts here for making it possible for me to come over. Okay, having said that, let's get going. Except this doesn't want to go to the next slide. Again, because of different diverse understandings of the word conservation, I thought it might be useful to take 30 seconds to just discuss this. So when I say conservation, I come from a South Asian perspective of looking at conservation as the broader, all-encompassing nature of work in the historic built environment. So the equivalent here would be work which encompasses both preservation and cultural landscape work, right? And in some respects, because of the colonial origin of conservation in South Asia, there is a move now to look at it as heritage management rather than just conservation. So I'm looking at a whole umbrella. The starting point for my lecture today is understanding for folk in conservation to know both the deep and the narrow, right? We need to know our materials, we need to know our structures, we need to know the context, but we also need to know the interconnected nature of conservation, because conservation is no longer a limited elitist. It is elitist in many ways still, but it's no longer limited to monumental ruins, right? It encompasses a lot more. So we need to have this sort of interdisciplinary understanding of what the issues are. And again, when I say in the abstract that conservation in South Asia is necessarily entangled with communities. There is, of course, a question of could there be a South Asian perspective, since we're talking about heritage, and heritage is extremely contextual. But at some levels, given the histories of how conservation has developed in this region, I would say yes. So there are shared perspectives, but they're not common perspectives, right? And when I say entanglement with communities, the challenges which are shared are both practical and ethical, right? So practical in terms of just the sheer number of people and challenge of trying to distribute resources to people across in an equitable manner, right? So how do you balance the needs of what may or may not be relevant ancient ruins with the immediate importance of daily life, right? It's that kind of a challenge. And my work with communities is also, in a way, like a personal journey of learning and unlearning and relearning. So that's some of what I'm going to talk about today. Over 25 years ago, when I first started off as a young conservation practitioner, and I was trying to make an argument for community engagement, I would always get a pushback, right, from diverse stakeholders that I work with, including communities, saying, what does the science of conservation have to do with communities, right? And nobody says that anymore. It's now commonsensical that, of course, for conservation to be sustainable and inclusive, you have to have communities on board, right? So this is a no-brainer now. So this is it. It's like I'm happy to notice the shift, but at the same time now I feel there is this moving to the other end of the spectrum of romancing communities as the repositories of all sorts of ancient wisdom, right? Whereas the reality is somewhere in between. Of course, there are communities who are repositories of certain kinds of wisdom that we have no access to, and of course, we need to work with these communities to share this knowledge. But at the same time, it's also that working with communities is problematic on the ground. So that's where I come in from, that trying to bridge between what actually happens on ground with what are the discourses and policies and theories. Okay. And before I jump into the presentation, I also want to qualify the use of the word the good, the bad, the ugly in my title. That was just to get my point across to the audience, which I assumed would be interdisciplinary. I do not believe in these kind of categories, right? Because that would defeat my work. So, okay. All right. Yeah, is that good? Okay. So what I mean by that is a lot of my critique is about breaking down our need or the way our expertise has developed to categorize the world. Whether we are academics or professionals, we work within certain categories. And this isn't really conducive to working with communities on ground, right? So, but obviously, if I come here and say, oh, it's complex, it's messy, it doesn't mean anything. So, which is why I've tried to break down the presentation this way. I've worked with diverse conservation landscapes in the UK and in India. And through the Fulbright year, I'm learning some of the nuances of preservation and cultural landscape work in the US. But for today's presentation, I'm largely going to draw on my long-term experiences, three main conservation landscapes in South India. Hampi World Heritage Site in northern Karnataka, and the metropolitan region of Bengaluru in southern Karnataka, and the Tamirabarani River basin in southern Tamil Nadu, deep south Tamil Nadu. So all of these landscapes are tied together through a sense of iconicity, but the iconicity takes different shapes in each of these landscapes. So Hampi is an extremely significant site for South Asian history. So it's known to be much like maybe other Southeast Asian sites, like remains of like an ancient civilization, monumental ruins. So I don't have to get into that too much. Bangalore, or Bengaluru as it's been renamed since, is seen to be like almost like an antithesis of Hampi, right? It's modern, it's cosmopolitan, it's futuristic. So its iconicity was seen in the fact that it would shed the baggage of history and move on. But now there is a shift to look at the concerns of, oh wait, it's not just monumental, everyday heritage also matters. So it could be these kind of rituals in the city, or it could be the water infrastructure that shape the city, right? So there is that shift now. The third landscape that I call upon for my presentation today is southern Tamil Nadu, Tamirabarani Basin. which is known for both its monumental temple complexes by the river and also its iconic nature along a very significant biodiversity site. It's a tiger preserve, it's known for its iconic waterfalls, and it's just like an overabundance of things going on over there. So, in a way, these landscapes also mark the shift in conservation from looking at sites to landscapes, right? This nature to bring more and more sites and landscapes under the conservation umbrella. You can see that shift. I'm also going to draw on certain sort of community engagement initiatives that I've initiated, ideated, tried to develop over the years. And when I say communities, I don't necessarily mean just communities who are native or indigenous to the land. Depending on the context, it varies. So in some instances, the initiatives have been working with school groups, schools which are near historic landscapes or historic sites. In other instances, it's about working with maybe like village elders near like a protected site, or it could be a historic neighborhood of the city, right? So the nature varies. Besides this, my research trajectory has also been focused on working with community groups, starting with my master's dissertation a very long time ago now, over 20 years ago, where I worked with the communities in the city of York in England, where the medieval abbey precinct was going to be reformulated through a master plan through a lottery fund from the central government. So that was my starting point. To internship at CMEO SPAFA in Bangkok, and then with Common Ground, which was a landscape and archaeological charity in the UK, and then again my doctoral work, which was in ethnography at Hampi World Heritage Site. So I'm just trying to bring all this up so that within the limited time, I can only bring in certain vignettes, right? But there is a larger body of work behind it. Yeah. Besides this, I've also worked extensively with craftspeople. I'm not going to bring that up today, but it is just to make the point that all of these have informed my understanding of what it means when communities get tangled with heritage making processes. I'm going to jump into the good now, starting with some films I made with local residents of certain neighborhoods in the city of Bangalore. These neighborhoods at that point of time were not seen as having any history worth recording, and they were earmarked for developing as the base for the tech industry. So a lot of people who know Bangalore know it for its tech industry. It's the Silicon Valley of India, right? So these neighborhoods were earmarked for that kind of redevelopment because we're seen as not having anything there. It was almost like seen as, oh, this is terra nullius, let's just redevelop stretches along there. So it may sound like a cliche, but straight away, heritage and conservation was a way to bring communities together. So there was this church, which was historic, but not officially designated heritage, was under threat of demolition because they were going to widen the access road to serve a new tech corridor, right? So the communities rallied together, and that's when I was doing some research in the neighborhoods of that in that particular neighborhood. So they got in touch with me. We made a short film about it, and it got a lot of like positive sort of response from not just communities of Whitefield, but also other communities. And then finally, they stopped that road right. It stopped. Similarly, 2 years later, in another neighborhood in the city, which is again seen as just another old marketplace, nothing fantastic about it. Similar kind of stuff where the city proposed to redevelop that marketplace because obviously they wanted to increase the rent that they could get, right? So again, we did like work together with groups. We made some films, and it was, for me, it was personally satisfying to see how the traders who initially spoke only about livelihoods, at the end of our interactions with them over 3-4 months, were calling on discourses of heritage as a way to save the marketplace. So it was no longer just save our livelihoods, it is save the livelihoods of folk who have been here for 4 generations, right? So that changed that narrative. Okay, so what was my learning through these kind of various initiatives that I've coming from a discipline which is typically seen as a crisis discipline, right? So it's always that, oh my God, it's under threat, it's the last market, it's the last this, it's going to be demolished tomorrow, we need support for this, culture is dying. But I've learned that that is typically the perspective of folk like me who come in from the outside into a location. Whereas for people who live there or who lived there for a very long time, their culture is not dying and nor are they ignorant about their culture. Their life goes on and they're very well aware of what it is that they're holding on to and why they're holding on to it, right? So this was a learning for me. So in this context, a lot of my work is about critiquing the World Heritage Program of UNESCO, which is seen as this a way of like culture as diplomacy, culture as cooperation to bring diverse nations together, right? Again, it sounds like a cliche, but organizations like UNESCO World Heritage do play this role, right? You do need that one sort of nodal agency to bring all of this together, but there are huge problems with it. So there are benefits, typically short-term, typically economic, typically unequal. Some folk benefit way more than others do. So in terms of long-term sustainability, we do need, like as somebody who's also part of this world, we do need to be more self-reflexive and critical about what it is that these kind of structures do. So these are like saying some of the perspectives of people that I've engaged with at Hampi World Heritage Site who have benefited in the short term through UNESCO. So some of them say that, I'm talking from fieldwork from 15, 10 years ago, or a long period of time. So obviously, these have to be placed at that time. So somebody said that they now have an email ID and visitors are able to write to them regularly. Somebody says the visitors help them create like a Facebook account. So the next set of visitors can reach them directly, so they're able to take them around the site. So these are the kind of benefits. But even though on the face of it, this might seem like it's just an economic benefit, but as I started talking to the communities more, I realized for them it was also seen as a way to sort of socially become more mobile, right? So it's not just the money, it was also the little prestige they were able to command through these connections, right? But what is the cost of doing this, right? So that's the thing we also have to think about at the same time. So moving on to some of the negative consequences. Many years ago, when I was a consultant for the federal agencies, maybe somewhat similar to the National Park Service here, I was called in to assess the impact of a settlement around that protected site, which shall remain nameless, because a lot of these legal issues are still not resolved, it's still ongoing. So another wing of the government was giving aid so that residents could construct permanent toilets, right? Because it's a village, it's not connected to the central drainage system. Right? So they were giving them funds for that. And a state government wing was giving them funds so that they could re-roof their homes and not keep them as tiled roofs anymore. Right? So these were two things that were going on, but they were not able to take in the funds to do this work because it was within the zone of a protected heritage site. So legally, the zone of protection comes higher than any other layers of law there, right? So money was available for them to sort of improve their living conditions, but they were not able to access that money because it was a protected site. So this was very early on when I was still a young conservation architect also. It really gave me pause. And I was like, of course it's fair, right? Like within the protected site, there are toilets built for visitors. Of course, they need to have basic facilities. And just outside the boundary of the protected site, you have folk living who are not able to access the same kind of minimum developmental benefits because something was declared a protected site, right? So this is just one instance I'm giving you. There were many such instances which made me stop. At the same time, I also acknowledge that the pressure is not always unidirectional. So it's not always the local government or the conservation expert or the NGOs who are sort of bearing down on communities living in and around heritage sites. Again, taking an example of some of the other films have done in the city of Bangalore. I had one instance where I found out much later. I had worked with 2-3 individuals I thought were joint owners of property. But I found out later the property was under litigation. And they actually used my film to authenticate their claim. Right. So I thought I was like, oh, here I am making a film to talk about this last historic property, whatever. But it was a very calculated move on their part to let me in to make the film. So there are these kind of like push pulls from both sides. So it's not always like the government is the bad guy. But just to complicate the debate a little bit more, so with each of these incidents, I reflect and then I change my perspective when something else comes into the picture. So again, where I realized that we need to keep in mind that even though communities do sometimes extract unequal benefits, it doesn't mean all communities are bad. And although typically folks who come in from the outside do have more power than the people who are living there around these kind of land. Yes. So to give you another example, I applied for a grant to an arts council under the neighborhood engagement category. And I had proposed a series of workshops for the students of a campus, right? So the campus came up in an area which used to earlier be villages, a rural landscape. So where the campus was located, there was one small shrine which was still sacred to a few villages around the campus, and they still had right of way to the shrine. But there was also the sense that as the campus grew, students who typically come in from the outside were not aware that these were actually villages and these are folk who have lived there for 4 or 5 generations before it became a campus. So there was a sense of, oh, these are just the guys where we go to get like a coffee, there's a cafe run by a local, or this is just where I get my photocopies made, or this is an internet cafe. Like, but they had no sense that these were people who had been there before them and this had been agricultural land, right? So I thought I was pitching to engage student communities to sensitize them about the history of the landscape around. But the Arts Council rejected my grant because they felt I wasn't doing community engagement. And in their mind, community engagement was I wasn't recording native customs and rituals, and I wasn't training students to record native customs and rituals. Right? So that my reasoning to that was completely the other way around. Right? To see that, to show students that folk who had lived in that location could be both modern and traditional, so they were not just villagers of the past. They're also citizens or modern residents of the city today, because the city grew up to swallow their villages. So moving on further from this in terms of, so who actually then needs communities to be native, right? In the context of heritage preservation, cultural landscape work. So this is just, again, a small vignette I'm putting up from like my work. I was doing a series of focus group discussions, conversations with residents at Hampi World Heritage Site. And one group said this to me. So we were just talking about how their lifestyles had changed and what is the impact of the World Heritage status. And they said that, just to give you all the context, this, it's taking time. So the image on the left was how the main street leading to one of the main temple complexes in the World Heritage Site looked like. The image on the right is how it was transformed after 328 households were given notices to evict from this main avenue leading to the temple. This was in 2011. There's a lot been written about this, critique back and forth. A lot of my work also engages with this. So even the authorities who initiated these proceedings were in a way taken aback by the violence of this displacement, right? This overnight moving 328 households. This is known maybe from like a mega infrastructure project, but such an instance from a cultural heritage site was like, at that point of time, less known. Now there are examples we know from all across the world of this kind of displacement. So there were a series of sort of cases filed by human rights NGOs on behalf of the folk who were displaced, and then there were counter petitions by the government. And in the end, they agreed that they would help rebuild homes for the folk who were displaced elsewhere. And the comment on top is because the government tried to be helpful and bring in architects from the outside to design this new location where they would be moved to. And the proposal was planning to construct traditional looking homes, right? Um, and the residents were like, but we did not want traditional looking homes. We thought we were now moving on in life. And they never bothered to ask us what kind of homes we want. First of all, we were displaced, and now they're picking up these kind of thing. You have to live in these kind of traditional homes, kind of thing. And whereas obviously I was not one of the architects called in, but my response would have been similar. Say, but we're trying to help you. Like, why would you not want these kind of homes, right? So it was that whole insider outsider kind of. Same. Again, I bring this vignette to say that, I'm not pointing the blame at any one type of agency. This is like across the board. So this was like a comment made by the founder of a cultural NGO. Which is exactly what struck me too. So there are 30 villages within the World Heritage Site, and some of them, to our eyes, do look rather modern. They don't look like a medieval landscape or whatever. So this is a similar like this thing about, but this is an ancient landscape, so the villages need to look ancient. Why do they look modern? This is not how I imagined it to look like. So then I started delving in deeper into this, and I realized there was a lot of this geographical imagination of what these kind of landscapes should be, right? And this works similarly in nature conservation sites as well, right? When you go to a tiger reserve, you expect to see only tigers. You're disappointed if you see, I don't know, small deer or mongoose or something. That's not the landscape for these, right? It's tigers. So it's a similar kind of thing about. So I broke it down, right? Because I had been engaging with these landscapes for a long time. So I broke down this geographical imagination as who is proper and who can belong, and who is not proper and can't belong. And this applies to both residents and visitors. So it's not just residents have to be proper, visitors also have to be proper, right? To appreciate this kind of a landscape. So proper residents are those who would be aboriginal, they would be farmers using wooden plows, rural, they would be living in historic looking settlements, they'll be selling local flat bread. Proper visitors are the ones who just see the sights and go, right? They don't mess it up in any way, kind of thing. So the counterpoint to then who are the improper residents and visitors? Improper residents are those who are commercial, they're greedy, they run restaurants, they run hookah bars, they live in suburban looking homes which don't look rural. They have glass top tables, flat screen TV, carved wooden doors. So basically those who are materially comfortable, and so they're not deserving of any welfare from the state. By the same lens, improper visitors are foreigners who dress. These are all various codes that were given to me, right? I was doing an analysis that this was very common across all of these. So it was hippies, white trash, simply dressed foreigners. So it was this whole divide about who was appropriate and who was not appropriate to a historical landscape. So I'm gonna like stop with that there and try to like sort of sum it up, which is like one large bit of my work on which I call surviving monumentality, which is like a parallel thing that I've been writing. And the point I wish to make here is that there is an outcome to this geographical imagination, right? It leads to displacement of people. We don't actually want to displace them, but they end up being displaced. We don't want to marginalize people there. We want them to benefit, but we end up marginalizing them. And the second point is that these kind of issues are not just Indian or South Asian. They resonate across protected sites and conservation landscapes globally, because we have our ideas of what these landscapes should be like. And I'm sure as residents of Hawaii, we must be facing a lot of these kind of issues as well. And finally, there are victims, but there are no victims, right? Because all of us are here largely because we want to do good. Nobody is here deliberately seeking to displace anyone or deliberately trying to oust anyone. Okay. Having said that, since my interest again is in practice, what can I do beyond certain limitations as an independent researcher So it's not just about why does this happen. So it's also like what next? Having figured out this is why it happens, what can I do about it? So one thing that I'm trying now over the last year or so is a two-pronged approach, one in terms of policy and the other in terms of the pedagogy, right? So policy increasing now with a colleague of mine who also shares some of my perspectives. We're trying to do more writing and more visualization to help different social actors, whether it is the local government or it is the heritage officials, the NGO, to try and see how integral the everyday social life of residents are to these kind of landscapes. So I don't just mean their cultural lives, grand cultural rituals, but literally their day-to-day lives, right? Dropping kids to the bus stop or like going to the market and buying vegetables and stuff. So this was one thing we were trying to do in southern Tamil Nadu. So I didn't speak about the environmental consequences because that would be another long video. So, but I'm picking up from that example to show this. This is not new to those who are in the design field, right? So this is literally just mapping of the desired parts, right? So what you see on top is the protected part of the landscape by the river. You see the river turning at the upper right corner there. It's a prehistoric site in that location, so it's been fenced off, and there are 4-5 settlements there who used that mound and the grassland in that landscape to sort of walk across. That was how they were connected, right? If you see below, we've highlighted these settlements and the paths that connect these. So whereas with the first image, you see the protected site as like cordoned off, and you see these points which mark these settlements, whereas the second one makes it more clear that, oh wait, there are still folk using this. So it could be the shepherd taking his flock of sheep from here to there, or there are a few shrines which are still sacred to them within the protected site. They come and worship occasionally. Or it could just be somebody who doesn't want to go across to the road but who's used to cutting across the mountain to get to the next village for the last 3-4 generations, right? So this is one thing we're trying to do with not just desired paths, we're also looking at storytelling, and we're also looking at the notion of networks and nodes. We use a lot of GIS to make these visualizations. The second thing that we're trying to do is, as we said, pedagogy. It's field-based, right? So I've been running a field school with a couple of colleagues in southern Tamil Nadu, where we try to bring up the notion of looking at heritage itself as pedagogy. What can the lens of heritage tell you about locations? What can our attempts to conserve these locations again tell you about these locations? So these are some small things that we have started here, like in our own limited way. And I'm going to stop with that.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Pippa. You finished quite in time. Very interesting and fascinating stuff. So we'll open it up for questions. So I'll start with those in the room, and I request that before you ask the question, please introduce yourself, your name, affiliation, etc. Any question?
Thank you so much. I'm Carlos Juarez here at East West Center Interim Director of our Research Program. And just again, delighted to welcome our visitor. Thank you for sharing this. And I wanted to maybe ask you to continue just where you left off, and that is, as you had these these field school opportunities, talk a little bit more about what it is you're engaging them with, because they're different types of farmers and the like, and yet you're connecting, just a whole set of different things. And I just like you to elaborate a little bit more. What is it and from that experience, takeaways, lessons that you've learned that are either challenges or opportunities. So just more about the actual field school you were just beginning to talk about.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I've just put that there because the question that you asked, we've had an opportunity to reflect on it, and it's going to come out as a book chapter, because it's again about our idea to share this kind of what worked for us. Let's see if it works for you. So it's coming out in this book called Knowledge Production Beyond Binaries. But just to touch on what it is that we're trying to do with the field school, our interest was to initially work with students, graduate students and undergraduate students who work within the built environment, right? And we framed that quite loosely. So it was not just architects or planners or future architects or planners, but also potentially archaeologists, historians, right? Those who literally work with anything to do with the historic built environment. And we've located this field school deliberately because we are aware that what we are doing is an intervention in a historical settlement along the river in southern Tamil Nadu. We've spoken to the local village council there. We have exchanged, like, again, this is all coming from the learning of 25. I would have not done it this way. I would have just been like, let's take the students and go drop them there. But I don't do that anymore now. So spoken to the village council, told them that twice a year, you will have this bunch of somewhat clueless graduate students. So please be patient with them. Please excuse us. They're here to learn, right? So that's the other side of things, of making the community. Because obviously you'll have students walking down streets, taking photographs, and then think somebody is doing palm weaving. They're like, let's sit with them and take a picture or whatever, post it on social media. And they need to be trained to know the ethics of doing this kind of stuff. And also among the communities, they need to know that they don't have to, right? They don't have to. They can push back. Like, you're in my face, get out of my way kind of thing. So it was this both sides kind of conversation. The program itself is about a week in that location. And we divide the days thematically. So it's not that we're talking about, oh, here is the historic landscape. We first orient them to both the physical geography and the cultural geography, right? So we give them a sense of mountains, river, paddy, because some of them, I mean, I can't say that, but I also grew up in an urban environment, so it took me a while to learn where certain kinds of crops came from, for example, right? It was even at that point, starting at that level. And this is not a curated experience. So we do tell the students that you will live with the locals. The locals will not go out of their way to like make special preparations for you. So there's no air conditioning. So it is for the students who are open to these kind of experiences, right? So it's not for somebody who expects like, it all to be curated. Meals are a big part of what makes my field school work, is what I've realized over doing a number of iterations. So we have somebody who cooks local food, the students get involved. Initially, they were like, oh my God, we have to eat rice and we have to eat these vegetables, we have to eat all this, because that's not how we typically eat in our urban households, right? But then they realized that it actually makes sense in that location, and it became like the highlight of every field school meal on the banana leaf and talking to the cook and figuring out what he's making that day or what is available locally in the market, that kind of stuff. But apart from all of this, it is also, we have 3-4 partners locally. So one is Nature Conservation Foundation. So we work with them. The students go there for a day to get a sense of the iconic nature side of that landscape. Then we have another partner who works with the historic temple complexes, right? And it sort of flipped it. So typically you expect temples to be all about religion. So in the temple complex, we expose them to the problems of managing temple complexes as historic properties. So it's not just the religiosity or the monumental iconic architecture or the iconography. It's how do you actually manage something this big in today's context, right? When the nature of what a temple means has changed. And then we go to another historic property, which was founded by Christian missionaries. So there we turn the narrative around there. So there we don't focus on the Christian mission side of things, but we focus on it as a historic estate. So can you look at it as a historic estate? What do you think it's doing here? It's like 250 acres. How do they manage this kind of a historic estate? So it's always about trying to, like the anthropological trope of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar.
Okay, so I'll alternate between questions from the room and online. So the first online question we have is from Sierra Kuko. The question is, do you have any advice for activists in the US who are facing threats from the Trump administration to sell and privatize indigenous American cultural sites like the Bears Ears and other public lands?
Gosh, so one thing if I've learned, which is not a satisfactory answer, because I've asked these kind of questions at other forums, is never to presume knowledge, because I am for sure an outsider. So whatever I say would be extremely insufficient. But all I can say is, for folks who are in activism, these are shared experiences globally. So there are other networks, there are other partners that we can sort of can come together to share our frustrations, and that itself does help, right? So it's not that we're alone and then this is happening only here. It's happening in other pockets elsewhere. So if she's interested, I'm happy to link her up so if she can get in touch separately to these kind of other groups.
Any question from the room? So the next online question, we have actually two from Sean Haygood, but I'll just take one question right now, and if there are none, then we can come back to his second question. So the first question is, how can storytelling and inclusion of local narratives reshape the design and management of cultural landscapes to reflect the evolving practices of communities?
So I feel they've answered the question themselves, because storytelling, in my mind, is a fantastic tool to talk about how cultural practices evolve, right? Because it can never be that one story. You come back tomorrow, the story has changed because the cultural practices has morphed, and there is that interest to understand just why it got adapted, right? So, which is what makes it then survive. And the other side of things, stories are always interesting, no matter how young, old you are. Right? Stories do capture us in ways that other forms of writing do not. Right? Other forms of writing have their place, other forms of visualizations have their place, but stories come first, primarily.
Then we have Karen Jolly from the history department. The question, could you expand on the temporal geography of ancient, medieval, and modern? And she has put these words, ancient, medieval, and modern, under quotes, for communities and their generational relationships to their historic sites.
I mean, people who work in history, critical histories, know this a lot better than I do. But as somebody who works in conservation, where we see the application of history, this is exactly the problematic, right? This designation of landscapes as ancient, medieval, modern, and the categorization saying we have X number of ancient sites, so we need Y number of medieval sites and Z number of modern sites. But most sites are all of it at the same time. They are ancient and they're modern and they're medieval. Again, I'm talking in the South Asian and possibly Southeast Asian context when I say this. I don't know how much this would transpose across geographies. Maybe then it's about reframing the way we learn and the way we categorize, to think beyond these kind of designations. And it actually gets tricky. Again, working with communities, I realize that these categories help them sometimes because they can then make a claim saying, like, for example, I'll give you an example. There was a farmer whose fields were going to be acquired, but he was able to make a counterclaim saying his fields have been fields since the ancient period. So I am maintaining that historicity, so you shouldn't acquire my fields. So it's like works both ways.
Okay, thanks. So maybe I'll ask a question, and if there's time after that, we can go back to Sean's second question.
Okay.
So my question, in a sense, is related to the last one. To reintroduce myself, I'm Sumit Saxena of the East-West Center. My main area of research is far removed from all this, which is environmental health. But I did dabble in some topics which are maybe they're relevant. So you use this thing that what's a proper village? People come with mental maps of what is a proper village, and then they're there and say, oh, this doesn't look like a village. Then you also use the word beyond binaries. So one of the things that we did work on and I'm still interested in is this whole phenomenon called peri-urbanization. And one angle to that is there are still places in transition have coexisting rural and urban characteristics. if you're parachuted into those places, in one direction, if you look, you will think you're in an urban area, and you turn 180 degrees and you will think you are looking at the opposite, you're in a rural area. So it's somewhat similar to parents that talk, okay, is this place ancient or is this place modern? So drawing an analogy, it's like, is this place rural or is this place urban? So I was just wondering, I mean, I'm not sure whether I actually have a question here, but I was just wondering whether this process of peri-urbanization, I know for other reasons, Bangalore is a classical Gurgaon, what is it called now? Gurugram. These are places, classical places which have a lot of peri-urbanization going on and a lot of environmental problems, including sanitation, which you mentioned. So as I said, I'm not really sure what question I have, but it just, I just had this random thought, this peri-urbanization, and how does that affect some of the things that you are doing?
Funnily enough, I am actually able to answer that question because Whitefield is a classic urban area. That is one of the neighborhoods I spoke about. It was seen as Anglo-Indian settlement. I mean, the histories are written about it elsewhere, outside of the city of Bangalore. But there were these agricultural settlements which predated Whitefield that have been there for at least 500 years, some of them. But all of this was seen as somehow secondary to the establishment of this another Gurugram in there might be arguments about whether Bangalore's IT came first or Gurugram came first, but let's park that. But that's exactly it, right? The need to have something like peri-urban tells us that our categories sometimes end up being too rigid. And that is exactly the stuff that I write about in Whitefield, where it is both rural and it is urban. But in the process of this transitioning to make it completely urban, what are we leaving behind? And why are we leaving it behind, right? And in my lens, like my lens is cultural, historical, typically it ends up because of this kind of breaking it down as, oh, this is not old enough, or this is really old, or like that whole, this is completely rural, this is purely urban. So that not accounting for the fuzziness of these landscapes.
Great. So let's go back to Sean for the second question, and he has introduced himself as being affiliated with the School of Architecture. So the question is, what are some of the positive and negative aspects of community engagement observed in conservation efforts across South India's heritage sites and landscapes?
Okay, positive and negative aspects of community engagement. I mean, one fantastic positive, not just in South India, but across the board, is the fact that people are now accepting notions of heritage. So because of my training in UK and working there, so I know a little bit of the history of from the Western Europe side. So there was this whole divide between heritage and history, right? So heritage was seen as, oh, it's just like whatever for people. And history is disciplinary. I'm talking 200 years ago. So there is that reverse sort of moment now when heritage is seen largely as, or was thought of as only monumental sites. But now there is much diverse understanding of, archaeological mounds can also be heritage sites. And I don't just mean among experts, like communities feel this. Communities are coming forward to say, this is like an ancient mound, possibly, or they're saying things like this could be pottery sherds, or whatever, right? But it's that democratization in a way. So that's, I would say, is positive. So there's a lot more opportunities for communities to come together. Again, it sounds like a cliche, but it has proved true many times in my work that they do rally together on this, even though they're socially divided along other axes. The negative aspects is what I have written about elsewhere, especially for me who comes from a design sort of background. The sort of the tendency to attribute natives with all wisdom, with all and what's the right word that I want? Uncorrupted knowledge from the past, whether it is of building practices or it is of like rituals, right? So it's that two sides of the coin, which comes back to this thing of peri-urban, because that I've seen in Bangalore too, that because they're seen as this, so it's always like, oh, they're doing a village festival, not that, oh, wait, this is not a village anymore, it's now part of the city and this festival is part of the city, right? So it's that way of looking.
Any questions?
Hi, I'm currently a master's student and a scholarship holder with East West Center. I'm studying. My question is around like how does conservation and ecotourism play into the dynamic that you talked about? Like how does that create exclusions and restrict access? And I was interested because I've been to some tiger reserves in India, like Chincorbett and Ranthambore, and I was just interested in how land use is like owned by the people there, whether there was such a thing as commons or whether most of the land there is always owned by people. Yeah, so also because I'm reading like this chapter now, which is talking about how traditional ideas of ownership is about commons and then they become but then in Southeast Asia, it's often owned by people. So just want to understand how is the context like in South Asia.
So again, because of my work, which sort of goes across cultural heritage conservation to nature conservation as well, I work with colleagues and we've done projects together. That's how I know a little bit. But also coming from a landscape perspective, I would say the idea of commons is very limiting. It doesn't quite capture nuances even within what is stated as the commons across regions, right? Like in our own languages, you have different understandings of this kind of shared land ownership. So it could be like a Bungutopu, it could be a Bomala. So it varies, right? So it's just about, it's a location where people can put their cattle together, or it's a location where there is a pond which is available for everyone where they will clean, but it's a location where there is a shrine where there would be the festival. So each of these are various types, right? So that's one thing. So just putting it all under commons and trying to again look at them the same way becomes problematic. I am afraid I'm completely it sounds really horrible to say so, but I am not a fan of anything that says it's ecotouristic. They're well intended. I have to accept that. It is not, because it's again, people are searching for solutions, because the folk who work in tourism, who work with the communities, are aware of these negative consequences. So they're always trying to rectify. But yeah, I don't think ecotourism is, it's just putting another sort of label to the same kind of problems. Yeah.
Okay, let me ask the last question. Again, I'm not sure if I'm phrasing the question correctly. Let's do a hypothetical exercise. Suppose there is a site whose sole purpose is wildlife conservation. Maybe they have one species or two species. And another site whose sole concern is heritage. What would be the top one or two differences you expect in this business of community engagement?
I'm going to annoy a lot of my colleagues who do excellent work in nature and wildlife conservation, but Hampi is one such site where it is a World Heritage Site. It's also protected for bears and for otters. So it's three things overlapping, and it is a protected forest as well. So it's 4 layers of protection, but it is seen largely only, I'm sorry, I forgot. The geologists are going to be angry. It's also a protected geological site as well. Some of the most ancient rocks on Earth from deep within the crust. But largely it's that those who work in the cultural heritage or preservation sector are used to dealing with communities because they do believe straight away that communities should have some role to play, right? I would say that is a little difficult to still sell to some people who work in conservation biology. Let's be more specific rather than generalizing ecological conservation. Some folk in conservation biology, that will still be difficult to accept.
But in India, it's been like quite some decades since they have concept of social forestry and things like that. So that mindset has not changed.
For some people, right? It's again about what is our interest. No? So if my interest is in that particular species, then anything that comes in the way is harming that species, right? So it's just that perspective.
Thanks a lot, Krupa, and thanks to. Oh, sorry, we have one more.
Well, I want to take the opportunity just for a last quick question to switch your chip, because you shared with us some valuable insights from your work and then things you've been doing in South Asia in particular. But you've now spent a fair amount of time in Pennsylvania as a visiting scholar there. One of basically the core mission of the Fulbright program, similar to what we do here at the Eastman Center, is to help increase mutual understanding between people of the U.S. and people of the world, in this case, India. So you share with us your insights, your world. We understand a bit. But I want to turn it and ask some final reflections on what have you learned about the U.S. on these similar issues of preservation, conservation, and we're a big diverse country, so it will vary and where you're located. But any quick takeaways of something that either is different from the U.S. because you also have the UK perspective, which based on its long history, etc. In the U.S., well, we're not as historical or old, but quick thoughts on what you can share about the U.S. that you've learned, that has informed what you already know. Yeah.
I mean, at a very broad level, I was surprised to learn there is no Ministry of Culture here. That is something that I had presumed that all countries would have, and so that was the starting point. Specific to Philadelphia, so they would disagree with me saying sport is culture. So that's like a huge, but it was fantastic. I've had more football and more whatever than I have ever learned, and I've managed to learn, and it is a culture. They take it very seriously. But jokes apart, I did not expect to see and to learn that there were a lot of people who were engaging with the complexities in similar ways as in South and Southeast Asia. I kind of seeing it from the outside, had a less granular idea about it. So I was just thinking maybe it would just be a single issue, right? So it would usually end up being only about race. It is. But there is also a lot of nuance within that. Right? So I did not expect that. So that was actually, it was good. It was a good learning for me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I don't know, before Carlos cut me off, whether I thanked all the audience and the online folks for being engaged. I think we almost had 30 odd folks online, very encouraging. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you.